Microphone. I can read my text from up here. I am going from here to Kiev tomorrow, where there's going to be a conference organized by the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine on the 1917 revolutions. So I'm going to be giving a version sort of in what passes for my Ukrainian, which is probably closer to Surzhyk, in Kiev Thursday and Friday. So this is a dress rehearsal with all of you. I have to reduce that to 15 minutes, so that I get 40 minutes with you at least. I get to expand a bit on my thoughts. So although we're talking about 1917 because it's the 100th anniversary, and a big anniversary that is, I'd like to put the 1917 revolution in a couple other contexts of anniversaries. One is 1991, so 25 years of Ukrainian and Russian state independence, which is important for my story upcoming. And then a third anniversary, which is the third anniversary of the war with Ukraine, Russia's war with Ukraine in 2014, following the Euromaidan. And I think all of these moments have changed the way we as historians can think about Ukraine as a state, as a nation, and that brings us back to the revolution. So even though you have a whole year of events, as you just heard, talking about the Ukrainian Revolution, most of you probably don't know there was a Ukrainian Revolution, unless you're Ukrainians or historians of Ukraine. And part of my mission today is to try to convince you why it is that you don't know about the Ukrainian Revolution, and what you need to know about it to understand that other one we call the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Again, I think although most Americans and Europeans these days, thanks to 25 years of independence, know that there's a Ukraine that's somehow distinct from Russian, but they're not exactly sure how it's distinct from Russian, and that's maybe a good thing. That gives us work to do. But I think the war with Russia has posed for the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian studies and scholars of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian history a kind of existential threat. I mean, Ukraine's national anthem, as you all know, is Zheny Merla Ukraina, which is a kind of very pessimistic view of Ukraine's existence, and I think Poles have the same problem of sort of doubting that they're sort of marveling that their nation has survived, and I think that's not an accident that Poles and Ukrainians think that way, because they've been dismantled a few times by empires on both sides, and sometimes even farther away. So I'm half Austrian. That's my closest thing I have to Ukrainian identity, Habsburg by extension, and as a historian of Austria, sort of secondary occupation of mine, I see some disturbing parallels between Austrian history and Ukrainian history. Austrian history had this thing called the Anschluss complex, as you may know. It actually happened in Anschluss in 1938 when Hitler annexed Austria, the Republic of Austria. It went out of existence until 1945 as a separate state. But even before 1938, in 1918, when the first Austrian Republic separated itself from the Habsburg Empire in November 1918, Austrian Social Democrats wanted to annex themselves to Weimar Germany. I mean, admittedly, Weimar Germany was better than Hitler's Germany, but still the idea was that Austrian political elites, both socialists and monarchist and conservative parties, did not have faith that the Republic of Austria could survive on its own. There's a German word, those of you who like long German words, Lebensunfähigkeit, which means the unviability of the Austrian state to survive without being part of some bigger thing. I would say Ukraine, until at least 3 years ago, also had an Anschluss complex with Russia. That Ukrainian elites, somewhere deep down inside, did not believe that Ukraine deserved to exist on its own. Putin says outright that Ukraine does not deserve on its own, and he denies that Ukrainian statehood is real nationhood, but that's another story I'll come back to later. But Ukrainian elites have not had faith in their own viability as a state and a nation, and again, that's not an accident. There are reasons they don't have faith, and that's. But why is it that? And again, I said today's war with Russia's war with Ukraine, the very idea of the existence or the deserved existence of the Ukrainian state has been put in question by Putin and by his elite media out of Russia. There's a regular insistence that what's happening in Ukraine is purely a civil war, with no kind of foreign intervention, and that Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist, and what does exist is a fascist regime supported by outsiders. This year is the United States and the EU, back in 1917, it was the Germans and the Austrians who had invented the Ukrainian nation as a way of breaking down the Russian Empire. So this idea about Ukrainian statehood is important. People live and die because of this idea of the artificiality or inventiveness of Ukrainian statehood. So I wanted to talk a little bit about another aspect of as a historian of Ukraine. I mean, I started as a historian of Russia. When I first started studying the revolution of 1917, I worked at Indiana University with Alexander Rabinovich, who was probably the most important historian of the revisionist view of 1917. He sought to demonstrate that the Bolsheviks in 1917 came to power on a wave of popular protest, going against what had been a kind of Cold War consensus that the Bolsheviks seized power illegitimately from what had been the legitimate February Revolution and the democratic government of the provisional government. So Rabinovich said that at least for a few months in 1917, the Bolsheviks were much more open, pluralistic, democratic than a lot of the other parties, which made them sort of ahead of the crest of the revolutionary scheme and allowed them to win. So that's a big part of historiography about 1917 that I grew up with, and as a result of that, I didn't stay at Indiana, because if I had stayed at Indiana as a graduate student at Rabinovich, I would have had to do 1917 in Saratov, 1917 in Rostov, 1917 in Odessa, somewhere in 1917 I thought, не надо, не треба. So I abandoned 1917, despite the fact that when I was a graduate student at Stanford University, my advisor at the time, Terence Emmons, introduced me to a man who called himself a Siberian socialist revolutionary. So my first living sort of tied to that epoch, who was writing his memoirs about the revolution and civil war in Siberia at the Hoover Institution, where I was doing my own research, and so Terry thought that I could help him edit his volume. Yeah, I did. I learned all about Kolesnichество and about Siberian regionalism and the whites and Kolchak and federalism and all those good things that the SRs in Siberia did. But I was not a Svidomi Ukrainets. I don't mean Ukrainets, I mean Ukrainist. I hadn't sort of unprocessed my Russian imperial education enough to ask him about his last name, Dotsenko. When I wrote the biography sketch for the blurb on the text of the book cover, and it said he was born in Chernihiv, and he was arrested at the age of 18 in Novorossiysk, which also happens to be sort of considered Ukraine by some people. So he was exiled from Ukraine to Siberia for lifelong exile under the Tsar. And but I never asked him about what his Ukrainian life was like and what it had to do with Siberia and revolution. He was, however, again, I think I developed a kind of bromance with the Siberian social revolutionaries, maybe socialist revolutionaries more generally. But let me see about. I played the accordion too. Another thing. So he would invite me to his home with his daughter for vodka and herring and all the usual sort of Siberian goodies. But he would say, you can play anything from your repertoire except two songs: the International or Bozhe Saryakhveni, because both the Tsar and the Bolsheviks arrested me, put me in jail and exiled me. And I consider both of them, hawks on both of them. I stood for democracy and revolution in Siberia. So his version is the third way, sort of parliamentary, all-socialist government, anti-Bolshevik, anti-white. And so that was his vision. And to some degree, what I'm doing now is working on a Ukrainian version of that in a man named Pavlo Krystyuk, who, if you know your history of the Ukrainian Revolution, wrote probably the most famous, but never translated, set of 4 volumes called Zamitki и материалы до истории Украинской революции. He started that book in Kamyanets-Podilsk when the last Ukrainian government that he served in was in exile there from the Bolsheviks and the whites at that time. He finished the book in exile in Vienna, in Red Vienna, where he fled until 1923. He wrote this book, which has got more documents than any other such collection, and even today, Ukrainian contemporary historians have just begun managing to start publishing official versions, or the archival versions testified from those collections that he brought out. And how he did it in Vienna, what he brought out was amazing, because he was a natural historian and a scribe, And his account is probably the best account, together with Volodymyr Venichenko, a Ukrainian social democrat, and Dmytro Doroshenko, a Ukrainian social federalist or cadet, the other two rival accounts. So, but I said when I was president of the International Association of Ukrainian Studies in Donetsk, so very peaceful Donetsk in 2006, one of the members of the tribunal, Ivan Zuba was there, and Mikola Zhulinsky, all kinds of big figures in Ukrainian culture and politics to some degree. He welcomed the guests at this International Association of Ukrainianists as he welcomed us as Ukrainians. He said, Международная ассоциация украинцев instead of Ukrainistov. And everybody laughed and said, these are different things, but in some sense they're not different. And again, I, as someone who learned Russian, spent a lot of time trying to learn good Russian and trying to get to know Russia, and I still consider myself a Russophile in most of its essential senses. In order to kind of get inside the Ukrainian perspectives, and again, there's not just one Ukrainian perspective, there are many Ukrainian perspectives, but they differ somewhat radically from more Russian perspectives. And it took what I have been calling my internal decolonization to sort of undo the sort of Russian imperial assumptions that come with not just my own version of history, but others. So this example I gave you with Dotsenko, that I didn't think to ask him about what being born in Chernihiv and being arrested in Novorossiysk and being a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in Ukraine meant for his later career in Siberia. Similarly, when I was working on my dissertation, which became a book on the Red Army, I was working in the Lenin Library in the Voyenny Odel. Issues and issues of newspapers and Sputnik, Politrebotnik, and all kinds of things about Ukrainization in the Red Army in the 1920s. This was a very big experiment that the Red Army conducted through pretty much into the early 30s, in which it was creating Red Army units that functioned in Ukrainian, had Ukrainian titles for their ranks, and somehow were okay with the Soviet regime until the early 30s when they were abolished together with the crackdown on other things Ukrainian. So I had all that material, which I still have in my archives at home. I didn't know what to do with it because it didn't fit my idea of the Soviet Union, and I hadn't had my own imperial turn or come to my Ukrainian consciousness. So I left it out. So you won't find a word about Ukrainization in my book. And I knew about it, but I didn't see it. So this is what I want to say. Russian historians have been blind about the national question. They've been blind about the imperial question, which is the reverse of the national question. And that's especially true in 1917. So let me start with what we might, I think we're getting too excited here. Soviet History Survey course was something like April, May of 1918, when the Czech Legion had a mutiny against the Bolsheviks along the Trans-Siberian Railroad and unleashed the kind of overthrow of Bolshevik power which had just enjoyed its triumphal march since from November to April. And all of a sudden, overnight, that triumphal march was undone by this Czech Legion uprising. Okay, that's one thing. So the other thing is that the first war that the new Soviet-Russian state fought was the Soviet-Polish War of 1920. And it was a war, again, of a socialist Soviet-Russian Republic against now Second Republic Poland, resurrected from the same empires that Russia and Ukraine resurrected them. And finally, I told this story about when did the Bolsheviks become this dictatorial, monolithic, intolerant, repressive party. And that's, again, according to Rabinovich, that happened sometime in the Civil War. We're not quite sure when. That the Civil War, which we think started in April, May 1918, is what led to the turning of the Bolsheviks into this dictatorial party. Okay, so I want to introduce a few inconvenient facts for this narrative. First of all, on December 17th, 1917, the Bolshevik Council of People's Commissars issued an ultimatum to the Ukrainian People's Republic and to the Ukrainian Central Rada and to the Ukrainian people, demanding the passage of Red Guard troops across Ukrainian territory to to defeat the Don counter-revolution of the Don Cossacks in the south. When the Ukrainian Central Rada refused to give up its sovereignty to the Red Guard troops, the Bolsheviks declared war. And some of you may know Benedict Anderson's work in Opens on Invented Nations, or Invented Communities, begins with his sense of confusion or disbelief or denial of why it is that a communist China fought a communist Vietnam and communist Cambodia. If they were all internationalists and sort of transcended nationalism, what was all this stuff going on? So he could have gone back to December 17, 1917, when the first socialist Russian republic attacked the first socialist Ukrainian republic. But first time the Bolsheviks were successful, they were beaten back because some of the troops that were sent to ostensibly go against the Don Cossacks, when they realized that they were going to be fighting Ukrainians, they said, no, that wasn't what we bargained for, and they deserted. So that first war that was declared by the Bolsheviks was a failure. So we can understand why maybe historians that want to count that as the first war. But a second war broke out 2 months later, in February 9th, 1918, one day after the Central Powers recognized for the first time in history a Ukrainian People's Republic. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire recognized the Ukrainian Republic. The Bolsheviks were supposed to sign a peace too, but Trotsky, in one of his several moments of peak, said, no war, no peace, I go home. And the Germans said, well, you go home, but you're going to start a war if you don't come back soon. And so as the Bolsheviks were leaving the Brest-Litovsk negotiations, a second war was started. This time it was successful, led by a left SR, Mikhail Muravyov, leading again Red Guards units from eastern Ukraine, who were mostly Russians, and who laid siege to the city of Kiev for 10 days. They bombed Khrushchevsky's house, and they were very proud of bombing Khrushchevsky's house. A kind of a cultural war was going on. They were very conscious of what they were bombing, at least Muravyov, but he boasted about it later. They had a reign of terror, in which they murdered Orthodox priests, they murdered Ukrainian nationalists, they murdered Russian officers they found, and again, thought that they were going to have a Ukrainian republic. This was preceded, by the way, by the declaration of the proclamation of a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in December 1917, when the Bolshevik delegates to Ukrainian Central Rada, and there were 2 in that government, wanted the Rada to call elections to the Soviets because they assumed that if there were free elections to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks would have an overwhelming majority and they would win. They called elections to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks lost a majority, they only got about a third, and so they walked out of the meeting and moved to Kharkiv, where they convened a new Congress, declared themselves the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Heard that story before? Maybe 3 years ago? Sort of people's republics that again have somewhat dubious legitimacy, claim that they're the real socialists, and these other people are counter-revolutionaries and bourgeois and have to be wiped out eventually. So that's the few wrinkles I want to put into the story. So finally, the Soviet-Polish War, if we even think of the Soviet-Polish War, was much more than Soviet Union and Poland. First of all, Soviet Russia and Poland, not the Soviet Union. But it was much more than just that. It was a frontier war in which Belarusians, Lithuanians, Poles, Russians, White Russians, Red Russians, and Jews were all being killed and killing each other. Mostly Jews were being killed, but the rest of them were killing each other. And so why do we call this, to this day, the Soviet-Polish War? Because those 2 states survived, and all the other ones, except Lithuania. Why Lithuania was left out, that's a good question. Lithuania was as much involved in that war. All those states were new. All of those states came into existence sometime late 1917, early 1918, and later. So none of them really had any claim to consolidated long-term statehood. But again, we leave out all those people because they were failed states until 1991. So they might still be failed states, but that's another. At least they've been on the map for more than a quarter century now. So and again, on my own example, I want to say that we as Russian historians have been blind to the fact that the revolution was about war, it was about peace, it was about land, it was about justice, but it was also about the empire and about nationalism and about national liberation, at least for almost half of the population. And that doesn't mean just non-Russians. A lot of Russians in Siberia wanted national self-determination. They understood it in their own way. So that's one thing I want to say, is that the revolution was about empire and it was about nation. And that's something that you won't find in most history. Ron Suni is an example, an early example, a rare exception. And there was a couple Latvian historians who called attention, but they were pretty much ignored. And so the revolution remains a Russian revolution. Whatever happens in Ukraine is part of the Russian Civil War. And what we know about the Russian Civil War in Ukraine tends to be told from the viewpoint or the vantage point of either the white generals, Denikin, Wrangel, others, Krasnov, or the Red Commissars, Antonov Ovsienko, Trotsky, etc. So the Ukrainian voice has been missing, as has been the Ukrainian Revolution. And the Ukrainian Revolution was the largest national liberation movement on the territory of the former Russian Empire that was not occupied by German troops. Had Germany not been occupying Poland, Poland would have been the leader of the national liberation opposition to the Russian Empire. But Poland was having his own problems under German occupation. He was making his own way to independence, but under German hegemony. Inside non-occupied Russian territory, the Ukrainian movement was the largest movement in the whole empire, and yet very few historians of the Russian Revolution. I remember last year, sort of as a build-up to the 100th anniversary, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies had a series of panels on 1970, and one I found most interesting, and I learned a lot from it, but I also started seeing the blindness of even some of the people I really respected a lot and admire a lot. So Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who wrote one of the best books about the Federal Revolution in Petrograd, and he's writing a new follow-up to it based on new archival stuff, so he's learning new stuff about the things he wrote 20 years ago. But at this meeting he said, I really don't see what we can learn about the revolution outside of Petrograd. And I thought, oi! And he's, you know, he's a very good historian, but as I say, he hasn't had to have some internal decolonization. So this is, and this is one of the things that Ukrainian historians of 1917 have offered us since pretty much 1919, 18, 1920, when they started writing these things. And I want to show how Ukrainian historians' perspective helps us sort of deconstruct the Russian imperial narrative. I mean, for most accounts, let me back up a minute. One typical example, just to drive this point home about the blindness of Russian historians. And I'm not saying it was the blindness of Russian contemporaries, because somehow they actually knew more about and felt more about Ukraine. I don't think they understood what was going on, but I'm not sure the Ukrainians always understood what was going on either. But they knew they had to understand what was happening in Petrograd. In Kiev, they knew that, because they knew their fates hung on Petrograd. Whereas Petrograd found Kiev annoying, a pest, which they would go away. And so they didn't bother to learn much about what was happening in Ukraine, and what they did learn was very filtered. So one of the most prominently cited, or widely cited, memoirs of the revolution has been a man named a revolutionary pseudonym of Nikolai Sukhanov. His book is called Zapiski o Revolucji, very simple, 6 volumes. In the 1960s, a historian of the revolution, Joe Carmichael, translated and abridged and published an abridged translated version of this 6-volume things into what's really 1 volume. And there's not a word about Ukraine in there. So I thought, maybe, and he's a Menshevik. Well, he's a Menshevik. So he's a Menshevik who knows everybody in Petrograd. He knows everybody in the Soviet, knows everybody in the provisional government. He's kind of an intermediary between all these people. So he knows everybody who's anybody in Petrograd. So, and most historians think that he was balanced. He tried to even understand the positions of people he disagreed with much more than a lot of other memoirists and chroniclers. So I went back to this English translation, and I saw again, not a word about Ukraine, not a word about nationalism. So maybe the Mensheviks really didn't care. So I went back to the original Russian. a quarter of that volume was about the Ukrainian Revolution and the national and how bad it was for the revolution, how it was betraying the revolution, why. And again, you start hearing these sort of these themes that the Ukrainian national movement is artificial. It's a bunch of wacky intellectuals who are misleading these otherwise good Russian peasants from their Russian patriotic duty. And moreover, not only are they these sort of minority intellectuals who are rabble-rousers and unreasonable and betraying the revolution and breaking the revolutionary front, they're financed by the Austrians and the Germans. So they're traitors on top of that. So why did Carmichael leave that out? Because he didn't think that the revolution was about empire and nation, and somehow it was about workers and peasants, and it was about that. It was definitely about that. It was about war and peace too, but it was about nationalism. And again, if you're a Ukrainian historian, you realize that the national and the social cannot be untangled. If you're Russian, you don't have to think about that because Russian is the default mechanism. It's the fallback. So you don't have to question it. All of the, and each party produced a few very good memoirs, and the Mensheviks were very, very good about memoirs in 1917. And again, they all, it's not fair to say that they were blind to the national question, which is what one of them said. Irakli Tsereteli, a good example. Here's a Georgian social democrat, Irakli Tsereteli. He was a delegate to the Duma from Kutaisi, so a Georgian. But he's so Russianized that he said, we social democrats, including himself, were blind on the national question, and that's why 1917 was a failure for the provisional government, because a Georgian social democrat is blind. So again, it's not just Russians who are blind. Georgians could also be blind. You know, a big Georgian Stalin probably was not so blind, but had a lot to do with nationality questions too. So I will say to you that the people who actually lived through the revolution were not blind to the question of empire and nation. They were certainly not blind to Ukraine. Milyukov is usually the one who gets the most blame as the leader of the Cadet Party for opposing Ukrainian national movement and any attempts that looked like Ukrainians were building a state out of the Central Rada. And I think all the people, the social revolutionaries, the social democrats, the Mensheviks, all agree, even the Bolsheviks agree that the cadets were the most opposed to decentralizing the Russian state, at least in the form that Ukrainians were demanding or asking to be recognized. But again, most historians will say, and even the memoirs will say, that whether they're social revolutionaries or social democrats, that they let the cadets kind of set the tone. So they were all great state Russian imperialists when they got down to even these socialists. And one of the things that Christuk finds so disturbing when 1917 happened, especially this first war of the Bolsheviks against Ukraine in December 1917 and then in February, is how he thought once the provisional government had overthrown the Tsar and the autocracy, that somehow people would understand that the empire needed to be fixed. And fixing the decentralizing power, giving more power to national minorities, at least allowing the use of languages. But instead, the war turned the cadets more to the right. The cadets who had been a little bit pro-Ukrainian before the war became very much focused on the Russian state, the greatness of the Russian state, the power of the Russian state in war, and anything that sort of deviated from that was treasonous. So, Christuk said that even though Ukrainians and non-Russians everywhere sort of took 1917 to be a revolution of dignity for oppressed nations, that they were going to overcome the centuries of indignation that they had suffered in the Tsar's regime. But he said, it became clear to us that Russian democracy, by which he means Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, cadets, left-wing cadets maybe, and the Bolsheviks, were not able to purge themselves of their own imperialist inclinations, and they did not see any justice in Ukrainians' demands. And that's true. And they were not blind about it, but they chose not to accept it, and they saw it as a threat to their own revolutionary front. I want to give a couple of examples of historians. Some historians, like Bill Rosenberg, recently retired from Michigan, wrote one of the best books about the cadets during the war, the revolutionary period, and it's about the cadets turned to the right. He actually read Christuk and cites him, but he's one of the only people in the Russian world who cites him. The other person who cites him is Oliver Radke, who wrote the best books on the Socialist Revolutionary parties. They weren't about the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, Christuk's party, but they were about the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party. But he covers Ukraine and the discussion between the Russian Socialist Revolutionaries and the Ukrainians, and he doesn't understand why they couldn't agree, since they were all federalists, they all were Democrats, they were all revolutionaries, so why couldn't the Russians, as he says the same thing, that even the Socialist Revolutionaries, who were the most pro-federalist, pro-autonomy, pro-national rights, that they too got infected by this great state cadet wartime right-wing turn, and that they too sort of were in tune with the cadets, even though their pre-war platforms would have suggested that they should be the most friendly party to these sort of things. So I think I made my point that one of the things Ukrainians can do is help us historians to internally decolonize our narratives of the Russian Revolution, bring back the national question. Doesn't mean it has to be the only thing or even the most important thing, but at certain moments it is the most important thing. And the fact that, and again, one of the ways in which cited Christuk and said, Christuk is onto something here, that the revolutions in Eastern Europe and outside of Moscow had some peculiar relationship to soldiers' movements, because soldiers were the leading force of the Ukrainian national movement. And he cites Christuk on this. So way back in the 50s, some historians at Harvard were telling their students that you should go read Christuk, but except for Rosenberg, and nobody did. So Christuk has a lot to say about the Ukrainian soldiers' movement. And again, it illustrates a great difference between the Russian and the Ukrainian narratives. For Russian social democrats, again, especially this guy Sukhanov, is very typical. Soldiers are a threat to the revolution. Soldiers are armed peasants. And again, if you're a socialist guy, you like workers. If you're a Bolshevik, you like workers. If you're a cadet, you like intelligentsia or white-collar people, so you don't like peasants. Even the socialist revolutionaries didn't trust the soldiers, the peasants in uniform, because they thought either we end the war, or the war is going to, either the revolution ends the war, or the war will end the revolution, by which they meant some kind of armed force would come over and destroy whatever democratic revolutionary gains they had made. So Russian revolutionaries, Russian democracy did not trust soldiers because they were peasants. Whereas in Ukraine, the Socialist Revolutionary Party in particular supported the formation of Ukrainian national military units because they felt that Ukrainian soldiers had the most mature and conscious understanding of the needs of Ukraine more broadly. They were peasants, but they were more than peasants. They were the ones sending resolutions from all over the empire. And again, Ukrainians were stationed all across the empire, from Vladivostok in the east to Helsingfors in the west to Georgia in the south. And they were sending the resolutions to Kiev saying, we want you to push harder against the provisional government. We want you to demand autonomy and demand a Ukrainian constituent assembly and demand a Ukrainian solution to the land question. And we also demand Ukrainian language, and we demand Ukrainian soldiers units. So they were pushing the Rada much harder and faster than the Rada wanted to go. And yet they kept the Ukrainian Revolution more united than one of the other things about the Ukrainian soldiers movement is that it was one of several non-Russian soldiers movements. Obviously, there was a Russian soldiers movement too. That Alan Wildman wrote a wonderful two-volume history of that. But there were Jewish soldiers movement, there were Latvian soldiers movement, there were Georgians and Turks and all kinds of other groups. Every national minority began arming themselves in the army and demanding to be separated out into national units. And the government in Petrograd sort of vacillated. Some of the military thought it was a good idea because the Bolsheviks were making too many inroads, and at least nationalism was something they could understand, as opposed to Bolshevism. Others opposed it because they didn't want to disrupt the front, which they thought would happen. So for Christuk, the soldiers are not a bad force, at least not for most of the 1970s. They're a positive force because they are pushing the Rada in ways that the Rada is afraid to go because it doesn't have faith in its own people, according to Christuk's account. So one of the other facts is that kind of, again, Christoph cites very much. He starts with an account of peasants, cooperatives, as the sort of constituent elements of the revolution, but he ends with Jews. And the very last paragraphs and the last pages of his 4-volume masterpiece are about his lament about how the Directory failed to stop pogroms against the Jews, despite introducing the first ever in history law on personal and national autonomy that included Jews, and it was designed as a Jewish-Ukrainian compromise. This was the first time that any government had introduced not just a kind of Austro-Marxist national personal autonomy, but give actual political rights to national minorities. Jews, Russians, and Poles were the first one, but they anticipated this expanding to others. The provisional government never set up a Ministry of National Minority Affairs. The Rada did. They had a General Secretariat for National Minority Affairs in their government by July 1970. So again, this is very different from the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks did have a People's Commissariat of Nationalities that was formed after the Ukrainian one, and to some degree to counter that. But it was, when the Bolsheviks created their commissariat, it was designed to win over refugee populations and prisoner of war populations who were being courted by bourgeois nationalist parties mostly. So the Bolsheviks didn't really have an interest in protecting the rights of these national minorities. They wanted to mobilize them against their enemies. And that's what the Commissariat of People's Nationalities, the People's Commissariat of Nationalities, served in the Bolshevik government. The Poles had such a minority regime enforced on them by the League of Nations, and they resented it, and as soon as they could, they got rid of it. And the Lithuanians had a brief experience with this kind of national minority protection, but again, they went out of business in the early 20s. So the Ukrainian Revolution is different from the Bolsheviks in so many ways. It's even different from the third wave that I described in Siberia. They were open to having all socialist parties in coalition governments, and the Democrats in Petrograd wanted all year long. They wanted everything from the Bolsheviks to sort of popular socialists in one coalition. The Ukrainians had that in 1917 briefly, and the Russians never had it. So again, there was a very big difference in the way the Ukrainian Revolution unfolded, almost from the start, almost from February. They were entangled with each other. One wouldn't have happened without the other, and to some degree, the continued dependence of the Ukrainian Revolution on events in Moscow and Petrograd was ultimately sealed its doom. But I think we can start looking at questions of chronology, questions of the character of regime, and once we recognize that there were some states here, proto-states, incipient states, but all of them were new states. The Ukrainian state was in some sense newer, older than the Bolsheviks. Something the Germans at Brest-Litovsk noted. They said, Ukraine was relatively stable in January 1918, whereas Russia is chaos, anarchy. And that's not the usual stereotype. We usually have Ukraine as anarchy, Russia is order. In January, February 1918, the Germans said, the Germans know about order. Ukraine had order, again, relative, whereas Russia was anarchy and chaos and civil war. So I think I've caused enough trouble for tonight. Welcome to some question and discussion. Thank you.